Hi, everyone. I'm going to give you guys a moment to kind of get checked in. Hopefully you can see me and things are going good. Looks like the chat is probably disabled. Let me see if I can go to my thing and allow chat. Can I enable chat once I've started? Live control room, info and settings. It says that chat's available. I don't see it though. Oh, let me see if anyone's here now. Hello, live chat. Hello, my three viewers. So I have the live chat going in YouTube, and I have my phone so I can pull up Twitter. There were a couple of questions, but these are things that we're going to go over today, like the Chinese Revolution. We're going to talk about that. So those of you who would ask me to review, I will reviewing that. I've got my spread going on here. I've got all my notes, and I'm hoping to cover a lot of information. Yesterday, I didn't get as far as I had hoped. But today I'm going to pick up, I think, with industrialization. I'll go over that a little bit. And then that will lead us into World War I, or I'm sorry, imperialism, World War I. We'll be able to talk about the Russian and Chinese Revolution, all the way up to present era. Again, I'm focusing on, like, you know, the main ideas that you're going to need to be successful tomorrow morning on the regions. So please, just a couple of things I've noticed from grading regions all day today from the US is, you know, a couple of mistakes I saw. Leave your pencils at home. Everything is done in pen, dark blue or black ink only. You don't need pencils. Also, please make sure that you're aware that there are two essays. There's the thematic, which is based on a theme, and that is part 2, and that is on the first page of your essay book. Then you have the DBQ essay. This is based on a series of documents. Even if at the end of the packet it says you have to use at least 4 documents, you need to answer all the questions for all the documents. Okay, so you have to complete all the questions for all the documents. Then you write your part 3 essay, which starts on page 7 of your essay book. Please make sure that when you're writing your DBQ essay, you're including outside information, that you're analyzing the documents, you're not just copying what it says. Other information, avoid gel pens. All you need is like a basic ballpoint pen. The really fancy gel pens bleed through the scantrons and can make it difficult for machines to read the other side, and then you can get an inaccurate reading on that. Anything else I noticed? It's hot in the gym, so bring some water. Make sure you eat well tonight and in the morning and get plenty of rest. You guys have been working hard, you know, especially those of you who've, you know, been coming to the reviews or going online. So please, you know, don't panic. You know the stuff. And I'm going to clarify some things as we go. I'll give you some time at the end. Any last minute questions, I can clarify for you. And I just want to remind you as well, you have like your word associations. Those are good to kind of go through just to focus on key ideas. Ms. Hardy's posted like word associations, etc. So please take your time tomorrow. I know you guys can do it. Use the test to take the test. Process of elimination, all those other little tricks that we are always telling you about. So I'm here You guys can live chat with me through YouTube, or I have I see a few of you have been following me. Feel free to share this with other friends who are taking global. Ask questions as we go. If there's a question about something from yesterday, you can send me that and I'll go over it at the end. So it's about 4:06 and I see there's about 8 of you guys with me, which is awesome. I'm going to post this video later. So I'm going to get going talking about the Industrial Revolution. So this is, sorry, let me open this quite loud. Late 1700s, early 1800s. You guys know where it begins? Yes, you're right, Great Britain. So it begins in Great Britain because Great Britain has tons of resources, right? There's coal, there's lumber, there are islands with a bunch of harbors, so there's a lot of waterways, so they can transport all these goods, and then they get railroads. And what we see is that the Industrial Revolution is really, helped by this agrarian or agricultural revolution. So the first agricultural revolution is that Neolithic revolution early in human history, where we go from being nomads to hunters and gatherers to settling down and having farms and little villages, and then we get these civilizations. Well, with this other agrarian or agricultural revolution, we start to use fertilizers. We're clearing lands, we're draining swamps, we're clearing forests. There's improved crop rotations. There's selective breeding for animals. I gotta turn the lights on by moving. Oh man, maybe I'll just sit in the dark. And all of this makes farming way more efficient. So there's a lot more food and you need less workers. And so what we see is people are going to start to move into cities to look for work in factories. And once in factories, people are going to be working. You're going to see that there's tons of laborers. There's going to be a lot of capital, that's money, invested in factories. There's new technologies. But unfortunately for the workers, and this happens to be most of the people, in this era, factory conditions are poor. There's low wages, long hours. There's dangerous situations, unhealthy. If you get hurt or sick, you lose your job. And as more and more factories are created, more and more people have to move into the city. And then we see that urbanization is taking place. Cities are expanding. And with, higher populations of people in small areas, higher population densities, you end up having all these other issues that go with that. There's a lot of sanitation issues that, garbage are in the street. This allows disease to spread. There's this one political cartoon we had on the midterm in review, and it had people digging in garbage heaps and said King Cholera. Cholera is a disease, and it's spreading because things are so unsanitary during the Industrial Revolution. So please keep that in mind. That's a big one. Out of the Industrial Revolution, we also get new ideas about business. And one of these is Adam Smith's idea of capitalism. People with money can make money by investing it. And, it follows this law of supply and demand. Basically, if you have a business, you need to supply what people want or you're going to go out of business, which is why every time we turn around, there's a new iPhone. And then people run out and they drop their hundreds of dollars, and it's keeping Apple in business. It also has this belief in laissez-faire, or as Ms. Hardy would say in class, lazy government. So this is policy where the government stays out of business. They let businesses do what they want. Okay. Another idea that comes out of the Industrial Revolution is capitalism, or I'm sorry, not capitalism, communism. Again, I'm going to do the Cold War later. Sorry, I'm just checking. And I can also talk a little bit about the French Revolution in a moment. So with communism, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and remember, I always said, Karl Marx, always on the test. Sometimes Friedrich Engels shows up, but he's going to be paired with Karl Marx. They write the Communist Manifesto, and they talk about this class struggle. The bourgeoisie, like this is the middle class, basically is getting rich off the backs of the proletariat or the workers. And Karl Marx and Frederick Engels believes that the workers, the proletariat, are going to rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie to end this class struggle, and then there would be equality. And they're going to create this classless society. Another thing that you can keep in mind is a lot of times instead of communism, you might see Marxism, and this is Karl Marx's like form of philosophy for communism. So sometimes you'll see them interchanged, and this is throwing people for a loop before during the our tests are also on the regions. So with industrialization comes a number of problems. Eventually, you kind of hit this critical point where you can only produce so much and have your people buy it. You only have so much land. But if you want to keep developing and keep growing and expanding, then you need to look for new areas to go out into. And what this will lead to is imperialism. Some people really benefited, though, from industrialization. You do have that bourgeoisie, that middle class that grows. They have a higher standard of living than they had previously. Life is going to be improved as far as new technology makes doing certain jobs easier. We also see that society is starting to evolve along with these changes. You know, by 1900, most men have the right to vote in Great Britain. You also get new science. People start to come up with ideas like evolution with Charles Darwin. But the biggest thing that comes out, and this is often a multiple choice question, is industrialization leads to a higher standard of living, especially for this middle class. You know, people don't starve because they don't grow enough food. If you're starving, you might not be able to afford food, but there's tons of food to go around. Thanks to the Agrarian Revolution and industrialization, you also see that people start to learn more about disease and germs, and then people start to bathe, and this will eventually help reduce the spread of disease. So there are some good things that come out of industrialization. But one of the most controversial things that comes out of this is imperialism, which can benefit some, but doesn't benefit others. And, you know, to quote, you know, one of my favorite shows right now, or book, The Handmaid's Tale, you know, better doesn't always mean best for everyone. Someone is going to kind of suffer. So with imperialism, this is the idea of a nation, a mother country going out and taking over another area, another country, a nation, or peoples. Maybe they're controlled them politically, economically, and culturally. There's different levels of control, but you have one country exerting control over another country. And they do this for a number of reasons. The first being economic, which I've already mentioned. You have new markets. You know, you go to these new countries, now you can sell them their stuff. Also, you have labor. You might be able to use these people cheaply to continue to make factory goods for you. Other reasons is political, military. You know, you want to expand your nation's borders, get an empire so you can seem stronger, more powerful to other nations. Perhaps you're looking for military bases or naval bases. And then socially, a lot of Europeans want to spread Christianity, or there's this idea of social Darwinism, which is loosely based on Charles Darwin's idea of evolution. So social Darwinism, idea of survival of the fittest. Europeans are you know, better than these other groups that they take over, which is why they rule over them. And then, of course, there's the white man's burden, which is a poem we've read in class and occasionally shows up on the regions as well. But this white man burden, this idea that since Europeans are an advanced civilization, they have a responsibility to go out to these people, bring them Christianity, bring them Western civilization, and help them advance their own societies. And if you remember, the one line I always, from that poem I always bring up is, you know, referring to these people in other areas as being half devil and half child. You know, part of them, they're, you know, heathens, but the other part, they're just very naive and they need us to help them. So that's some of the reasons for imperialism. And Europe is really going to lead the charge on imperialism. They're more advanced technologically, they have better ships, but they also have better weapons. Plus, their governments are more organized so that they can structure these imperialistic moves better. They also have more capital, more money to invest because colonies are expensive, very expensive. So some of the areas that will be imperialized by Europe, especially Great Britain, would be, if you remember, you have all these European nations in Africa, dividing up the country or the continent, taking little pieces here and there, trying to get access to resources. And this takes place in the Berlin Conference. So if you remember, all these European nations meet in Berlin. They're like, how are we going to divide up Africa? They don't ask any African people from Africa to come and give them any input. It's just Europeans. They ignore tribal boundaries. They cut tribes in half. They take tribes that are, enemies traditionally, and they push them together. And this is going to create a lot of tension for them in Africa later, after imperialism ends in Africa and a lot of these African nations gain independence. They're still going to struggle because these boundaries were arbitrary. They were just cut up how Europeans saw fit, ignoring traditional tribal boundaries, and this leads to conflict in Africa. That's a question pops up on the regions all the time. We also see in India, the British are going to push into India, and this will lead to conflict as well. One of the conflicts that pops up a lot is the Sepoy Rebellion. So if you remember, the Sepoys are these Indian soldiers who work for Great Britain. They might be Hindu or Muslim, but there is a particular gun that was going to be used by these troops, and the cartridge was covered in either pig or cow lard, which was against Muslim or Hindu religion, according to the type of fat lard that was used. And the Sepoys felt this was an attack on their religion, and they rebel against Great Britain, trying to get rid of this foreign influence. Great Britain crushes them and exerts even more control, establishes the British Raj, which Gandhi will then, stand up against later on after World War II. Another area, China. And with China, keep in mind, China has been wealthy for centuries. They have tea, porcelain, silk, and Great Britain wants those goods. But Great Britain didn't have anything that China wanted. So Great Britain gets their Indian colonies to grow poppy and turn that poppy into opium, which is highly addictive. Great Britain then took that opium from India, brought it to China, and got millions of Chinese citizens addicted to opium in order to trade and get silk and porcelain and gold and silver out of China. And what we see is millions of workers in China become incapable of maintaining, a job. They're addicted to drugs. It's going to affect the economy in China. But meanwhile, Great Britain's making a lot of money, and this leads to the Opium Wars. Opium Wars comes to an end. Great Britain wins, and they sign this treaty that is considered an unequal treaty. So this is the Treaty of Nanking. It's going to give Great Britain control of Hong Kong, which Great Britain controls into the 1990s. It also is going to allow Great Britain to continue the sale of opium in China. And this really hurts China. It wasn't beneficial at all. So those are some of the areas that, basically are taken over by European nations through the system of imperialism. But then on the other side, we have Japan as this symbol of what can happen when one might embrace some of the new technologies brought to them by these nations that tend to be imperialistic. So for years, centuries, Japan had been isolated. They didn't trade with anyone. Foreigners had been long kicked out. And then the United States sends Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan in massive warships to get Japan to open the doors. Japan They let the US in. Of course, the samurai have samurai swords, not really going to stand up to these massive warships and machine guns that the US had. But what happens is Japan embraces this new technology and information from the West. They will have what's called the Meiji Restoration, where the young emperor Meiji will start to westernize and modernize Japan rapidly. He sends people to the West to learn new technologies. They bring it back. The government invests heavily in factories. And the whole goal of Japan and all its citizens is to westernize. They don't want to end up like China or Africa or India. They want to be on top. And what happens is once they've westernized and industrialized, they too start to compete for colonies. They want to imperialize. And why do they need to imperialize? Resources. So if you remember, Japan's an island. It's very mountainous. They don't have a lot of the resources they need to industrialize. So first they'll trade. But when the Great Depression hits and they can't trade with Europe and the United States anymore, they need to start looking outside the box. And what I mean by outside the box is they're going to start to try to conquer land. They move into Korea, China, Manchuria. They even have a war with Russia over land, and they destroy Russia. Russia's so embarrassed. It was called the Russo-Japanese War. The Chinese fight Japan as well with the Sino-Japanese War. Again, Japan defeats them. So here you have a nation that was completely cut off from the world in a very short period of time. Not only have they rapidly industrialized, but they defeat all these other nations that are much larger than they are. So Japan's coming out on top. And you need to remember that because they're going to be a key player in World War II. Okay, so what we see, some major effects of imperialism are some positives. One, Europe gets new trade ports. They get materials for their factories. They have markets for their goods. For colonies, they actually get better medicine. They get schools, technology, roads, railroads. But negatively, it's very costly for Europe to maintain these colonies. And there's conflicts. And nations are fighting or almost fight over these, and it causes a lot of tension. And of course, negatives for colonies would be traditional values are going to come in conflict with modern ways. So think about the sepoys in India. They're struggling to maintain their Hindu and Muslim heritage, and the British are kind of forcing their own beliefs on them. You have the fact that they become economically dependent on other nations. And it makes them really hard for them to work outside of that system. Usually large taxes are being imposed on the native groups. I think in India with the salt tax, if you remember when we talked about Gandhi, and we'll talk about that again after World War II. And they have no political rights. The colonists don't have any say in the government, so it's hard for them to enact change. And of course, if we remember, imperialism is going to play a key role in World War I. So I'm going to pause there for a second and let you guys get caught up. I'm going to double check questions. So someone had asked about the French Revolution. So I did that yesterday, but really quick, I can run through some key points. So if you know the French Revolution or you watched the video from yesterday, this is a point. Grab a drink, hit the bathroom. Let me take out my notes so I don't miss anything. Where? It's right here. Gotta make sure I get my notes. Okay, so real quick, causes of the French Revolution. Neat. The monarch, he's corrupt. He's spending tons of money. He's living a very lavish lifestyle while people are starving. Enlightenment. All these Enlightenment philosophers are talking about the rights of the people and how if the government doesn't protect them, they have a right to overthrow. And so people in France who are part of this third estate, the commoners, like, that's a great idea. Let's overthrow our government. The American Revolution. The American colonists revolted against their king and established their own country. So peasants in France were like, if colonists can defeat their king and create their own country. Why can't we defeat our king and create a government, maybe a democracy or a republic that represents us? And then T for taxes. There are 3 classes of citizens here with unequal representation. The first estate are the nobles. They have like 1% of the population. Second estate is the church. They're like 2% of the population. And then the third estate is everyone else, including most of, or all of the peasants. They're 97% of the population. They're the poorest. They have no political rights, and they pay all the taxes. So whenever there wanted to be some kind of law or anything passed, the Estates General had to meet. So you can think of the Estates General like a parliament or a Congress, and you'd have the representatives come, and each estate got 1 vote. Well, if the first estate and the second estate are really wealthy and don't pay any taxes, they're never going to vote to increase taxes on them. So that third estate, that one little vote, who represents 97% of the population, can't change anything. So ultimately, this leads to a revolution. And there's 4 phases. The first phase is the National Assembly phase. So these peasants, the third estate, decide that they're going to fight back. The storming of the Bastille, which was where there was like weapons stored, happens, and this kind of starts this French Revolution. The National Assembly also meets at the tennis courts, and they take the tennis court oath and like, we are going to make a new constitution, and we're not leaving until we do. Eventually, the French king tries to escape with his family and is caught. And then we enter into the second phase. This is what becomes known as the Reign of Terror. This is the radical phase when you get Maximilien Robespierre, and anyone who was loyal to the king, including the king and queen, is executed. Anyone who doesn't agree with the revolution is executed. But then it gets to the point where so many people are dying that Robespierre himself is put on trial and executed. Then we get to the third phase, the Directory phase. This is where you have a small group of people ruling France. They're corrupt, they're stealing money, there's riots, and eventually Napoleon becomes the 4th and final stage of the French Revolution. He overthrows the Directory in a coup d'etat. He creates or proclaims himself emperor. He takes control of eventually all of Europe, excluding Portugal, Russia, and Britain. And his big downfall is he just keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. He invades Russia. Don't do that. He gets hit by the Russian winter, and most of his soldiers are killed. Ultimately, he's defeated and exiled. His Napoleonic Code, his law code, does continue. A lot of times it's linked to Hammurabi's Code or Justinian's Code because it's these set of rules. But at the Congress of Vienna, what we have following this is this meeting to figure out, what do we do with Great Britain or with Europe? How do we prevent this from happening again? One man from getting too much power and taking over the entire European continent. We don't want that to happen. So Clemens von Metternich oversees the Congress of Vienna, and they decide they're going to redraw the map of Europe just the way it was before the French Revolution. All the legitimate kings will be returned to power, and we're going to try to balance out the size of these nations. And we are going to, they say they're going to stop all the nationalistic or peasant revolts to prevent another war from happening. Of course, that's going to be short-lived because in the early 1900s, we are going to get World War I. Okay, so tips on an essay in lots of details. Okay, so really quick, just some tips on the essay that I'll tell you. And then if you're in my Google Classroom, I can point out some information. No two of everything. So know 2 revolutions really well. Know 2 political leaders really well. Know 2 revolutionary leaders. So when I say 2, like if like the Communist Revolution, the French Revolution, that's an essay on revolutions. If you know Nelson Mandela and Gandhi really well, those are some leaders of the massive change. If you know maybe 2 belief systems well, So say like Hinduism and Buddhism, or Christianity and Islam, something like that. Just know 2 of those really well. The big topics that pop up the most for a thematic is change. Individuals who've caused change, Gandhi, Mandela, or revolutions that have caused change, like political revolutions, communist revolution in Russia, French Revolution, or non-political revolution. So this could be like the Neolithic Revolution and the Protestant Reformation, which I did yesterday as well. So those are the first 2 big common ones. And the other one they really like is geography, how geography affects a region. So if you're going to do that, I would think about mountains in ancient Greece and how they create these separate city-states because they're divided, and river valleys. If you talk about like Egypt and Mesopotamia, you talk about how rivers affect those regions. Or another thing with geography they really like on the regions is how people modify their geography or adapt their geography. So a good one for that would be like the Aztecs with the Chinapas and how they developed these floating gardens, or Incas creating terrace farming. The Japanese also had terrace farming because they were mountainous. So like those could all be really good geography topics you could do. Some other ones would be like political systems. So maybe if you know like democracy or monarchy really well. Absolute rulers, like I would say know 2 really well, like Peter the Great or Louis the 16th from the French Revolution. There are some sites out there. If you just search for like thematic essays in my Google Classroom, I also have some samples as well. I can actually try to pull some of these up really quick and kind of link them. So give you guys a moment there, and I'm going to see if I can find this thematic essay outlines to kind of help people. And I'll share the word association. I shared like a word association. We did it in class. I could share the key. In the key, I have like little links at the bottom that take you to content, so you could always check those out too. So let me see if I can get that to pull up for you all. And I can post that in like the live chat. And let me check Twitter to see if there's anything else coming through. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a moment. See if you can maybe brainstorm some causes of World War I before I give them to you. It's one of those good practices for essays. Before you start reading the documents on like a DBQ, look at what the topic is. And maybe at the bottom of like the page, just start jotting down some ideas, things that you remember about those topics before you jump into the documents. Because one of the things I've been noticing is on these DBQs, people get so hung up on the actual like DBQ and using the documents that they forget outside information. So if you have outside information before you even begin to look at the documents, that might help you quite a bit with making sure you get some of that outside information in. So I'm just gonna come here. I'm trying to find for essays. So you guys, let me get a shareable link. My internet is being funky, so yay, I'm back. Internet kicked out. Okay, so let me get a shareable link. Can view. So if you're in the live chat, I'm going to post. So this is thematic outlines, and I just posted in the live chat. This is a link to Google document. They're thematic outlines. They're blank, but it can give you an idea of what's going on there. And then I'm going to post the word association. And this word association list, it says a key global vocabulary. These are the topics that pop up the most. And you can see links to content for that too. Okay, so if you're in the live chat, you should be able to see those hopefully and click on them. If not, I'm sorry, I tried. So World War I, hopefully you guys kind of came up with some of these causes. So some people teach this as the four main causes, or mania. So this is militarism. So you're glorifying the military. You're building it up. Alliances. Everyone's making these secret alliances. Nationalism. People have strong nationalist pride. They're pushing for either independence. So like in the Ottoman Empire, remember, Ottomans take over, a lot of the, Iberian Peninsula over there and what was once the Byzantine Empire, and through like parts of Northern Africa. And that's in the 1450s. Here we are in 1900s, and the Ottoman Empire is still there, but they've shrunk in size and they're starting to lose power. It's called like the sick man of Europe because there's a lot of nationalism spreading throughout the region. The region's very diverse, especially in the Balkans. And you remember the Balkan powder keg, lots of ethnic tensions. Everyone wants like their own nation, so there's a lot of conflicts. So nationalism, one, helps people like Great Britain or the French to kind of take pride in their nation and push them to become imperialistic. But you also have nations like in the Balkans fighting to get their independence from the Ottoman Empire. Then you have imperialism. So you have people, being conquered, but you also have nations like France, England, Germany competing to see who can get more colonies than the other, and this creates a lot of tension. Then you have assassination. So this is that spark, the final spark. So the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, and this is where people kind of get confused. So the Archduke is the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and he is assassinated by a Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip. And this just starts an all-out war. Germany declares war against, all these nations. Then Russia declares war back, and then before you know it, they're all pulled into it, and eventually the U.S. is pulled in too. So for the regions, you really should kind of understand those, mania, the causes. They're never really going to ask you about any of the battles. They might ask you about like the technology. You have trench warfare. They're using mustard gas, and this leads to a very high death toll, not just for soldiers but also civilians, and it's pretty terrible. People who do survive often are physically disabled. Some of them are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. You have the Allies, that's Great Britain, France, US, win. Germany is going to be blamed, and then that's going to lead to more issues for them. But a lot of Europe is destroyed. The land is just devastated, and these nations have to rebuild. And to rebuild, they have to get money. So they borrow money from the U.S. That puts them into debt. And then you have the Treaty of Versailles that's signed, blaming Germany. Germany has to give up their colonies. They have to give up a third of their land. They have to accept total blame. They have to pay large reparations to France and all these other areas, and that's going to hurt them economically. And the president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, was like, we need peace without victory. We need to end this, but we shouldn't punish Germany. But of course, Great Britain and France, who suffered the most, were like, no, we're punishing Germany. They're going to pay for what they've done to us. And the League of Nations will be created to try to maintain peace again. They want this idea of like a collective security. We're going to work together to prevent another war. But the United States Congress is afraid that by joining the League of Nations, the United States would be pulled into more conflicts. So the U.S. never joins, and it really weakens the League of Nations so much that they're not able to protect anyone. They're not able to stop another war, and ultimately it fails and leads to a World War II, which we'll be getting to momentarily. But now we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution. So if you're thinking about an essay topic, they're talking about revolutions. I reviewed France yesterday. I reviewed it a few minutes ago. And now the Communist Revolution in Russia is another big one. So the Communist Revolution in Russia also has to do with yeah, I'll tell you about Simone Bolivar really quick in a moment. So You have the Russian Revolution takes place during the beginning World War I, and the Russians pull out. It's one of the causes of the revolution. It's communist. Sometimes it's called the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Tsar Nicholas, or the King of Russia, was fighting World War I, and people at home were starving. They didn't have a lot of money, and this is really upsetting the people. They're like, why are we fighting these wars and we have no money? We don't. Even the soldiers didn't have proper equipment. They didn't have enough food, and so Vladimir Lenin leads the Bolsheviks and overthrows the Tsar. And what we see is Russia will pull out of World War I so that they can fight a civil war and then establish a communist government. So Lenin had promised that peace, land, and bread. He's like, peace, I'm going to pull you out of World War I. Land. Serfdom, where you have those really poor peasants, had only ended in the 1800s in Russia. So you had millions of really poor peasants. So Lenin's like, I'm going to take the land from the really wealthy and redistribute it to help the poor peasants. So of course the peasants are like, yay, land. And then bread. People are starving. He's like, I will help you guys get food. So millions of peasants are going to jump on this communist bandwagon, and Lenin will create this communist government. But it's going to prove difficult. So he's going to have to quickly allow, for some types of capitalism, he creates this new economic policy. People are allowed to sell some things for profit. Small businesses could be run privately, which of course, goes against communism. Communism, the collective should be working together, controlling the means of production. But Lenin was like, yeah, this isn't really working. We got to make stabilize the economy. So he pushes for this. Unfortunately, he's going to fall ill and die. Well, I say unfortunately for him. And what we see is there's going to be a power struggle when he dies, similar to what we see when Alexander the Great dies. There wasn't an heir. So when Alexander the Great dies and Lenin dies, there's this power struggle. And those who were kind of like the right hand and left hand man are going to fight over this. And for the Russians, it's going to be Stalin and Trotsky. And Stalin is going to use some ruthless tactics to help people kind of turn against Trotsky and remove him from power so that Stalin can take over. And he becomes this totalitarian leader. He has total control over the media, over the schools, over art, music, literature. Everything is controlled by Stalin, highly censored. And his whole goal is to industrialize Russia. And I had that meme, and it was like, there's no time for Stalin if you're Russian to industrialize. And so he comes up with these 5-year plans. We're going to increase agricultural output and increase industrial output. And there's various degrees of success. But one of the problems is, he's making all these economic decisions, telling people what to plant and how much to grow. And all these peasants have to feed the military and the factory workers. And Stalin decides to create these collectivized farms. I always talk about them, as like kind of like hippie communes, only way less hippie-ish. So all the peasants have to give up their land and work together on these large government-owned lands. And people are upset about this. So farmers will burn crops, they'll kill animals, trying to prevent them from being, kind of merged together. But this leads to a massive food shortage. You also see that Stalin will purposely, create this famine in the Ukraine, leading to the deaths of millions of Ukrainians. He diverts food. If people who are farmers aren't meeting certain quotas, they'll confiscate seeds that they need to grow future crops. It really punishes people, and there's just massive starvation. Plus, Stalin's like super paranoid. So he has the great purges, and anyone who is loyal to Lenin or anyone who he doesn't feel is loyal to him will be executed. People will admit to doing crimes they didn't do out of fear that their families would be hurt if they didn't. He also had like gulags, which are like concentration camps where people would be sent to work there, and many of them died. But it's just, very difficult life under Stalin for many, many years. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break and have some water. Let me check, make sure. Oh, Simone Bolivar. So Simone Bolivar is a nationalist leader in South America. I talked about him yesterday in these Latin American revolutions. He's going to help fight against Spain for independence. And he's the one who had this idea of a Grand Colombia. He wanted to unite all of South America, but was unable because of natural boundaries, and barriers. You have like the Andes Mountains, and you have the Amazon River and rainforest, and it made it too difficult. But the nation of Bolivia was named after him. And he, I believe, is also the first president of Venezuela. Okay. But he was, nationalistic. He was an independence, revolutionary leader as well. So, if you know a lot about him, that's a good one to know too. Okay. So then I'm going to talk about the Chinese Civil War and Chinese, Communist Revolution. So this kind of starts before World War II and then picks up after World War II as well. So what we see is that you have these dynasties in China, but they start to weaken, and eventually the last dynasty falls, and a nationalistic government is created called the Kuomintang, and this is led by Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen dies, and Kai-shek takes over as the nationalist leader. But he and Mao Zedong start to disagree about how China should be run. Mao Zedong is communist. He wants a communist nation, and this leads to a civil war. And Mao and his followers are going to be kind of forced to leave China, and they take that long march through the mountains of China. Only about 20,000 out of 100,000 people survive that march. But along the way, he meets peasants, and he's communist. And of course, in many of these areas where communism takes hold, there's a lot of poor peasants who are struggling to survive. And he really helps them. There is a brief pause in the Civil War during World War II because Japan invades China. And when Japan invades China, the communists and the nationalists kind of gang up on Japan. Japan, though, is attacking the nationalist military like head on, though. Whereas the communists under Mao are doing more like a hit and run guerrilla tactics. So they kind of emerged from this World War II experience not as hurt as the nationalist military, which had heavy losses to Japan and weakened them. And it's after World War II that the communists really emerge more powerful. During World War II, anything that was captured in war, the communists would always give some of the supplies to the peasants and won them over. And ultimately, Mao Zedong will win, and he will create a communist country where he'll rule until he dies in the late 1970s. But under Mao, there's a couple of changes. He creates the I'm like trying to find my notes. Little red books, if you guys remember, where people have to read from these books and know what I always call little Maoisms. He also has this Great Leap Forward, which he is going to base on Stalin's 5-year plans. He's like, we're going to rapidly industrialize, but he's trying to have people make like steel in their house, and it's just weak and not beneficial. And again, there's problems with that, and people start to turn against him. So then he has the Cultural Revolution, and everyone reads from the little red books, and he uses a lot of propaganda to talk about how great he is and what it means to be like the perfect Chinese communist. And young children are indoctrinated or kind of brainwashed into these types of beliefs to try to maintain control. And then I'm going to pick up about China after World War II to talk about, what happens in China after Mao. So, World War II. Let me check to see if there's any other questions before I move on to a new topic. No. Okay, so World War II is, this, I guess, accumulation of all the things that had gone wrong from World War I and beyond. So we know that there's a lot of struggles taking place in Europe following World War I. Europe is trying to rebuild. Millions of their soldiers and civilians had died. Then there's a Great Depression that begins in the U.S., and this is going to hit the entire world. And it's really going to make countries like Italy and Germany kind of ripe for fascism. So fascism, I always say, like, fascists are mint. They're minty fresh, right? So mint, militaristic, imperialistic, nationalistic, totalitarian. So they are building up their military, utilizing the military to maintain control. They're imperialistic. They're taking over either neighbors or countries further away. They're nationalistic, extreme pride in their nations, and they're going to build up nationalism and patriotism in their countries, and they're totalitarian. So you usually have one ruler with total power. So there's two nations in particular that you should be aware of for the global regions. The first one is Mussolini in Italy. So Italy was upset because they lost territory in World War I. They were supposed to get territory and they didn't, and they felt like that was, a slight against them. The government is corrupt, it's ineffective, and this allows Benito Mussolini to organize and rise up and basically gain control of Italy. And once in power, he makes himself an absolute dictator, an absolute ruler, to the extreme. He uses secret police. He has youth programs to kind of brainwash or indoctrinate the youth. He glorifies himself. He uses propaganda. He has, this black shirt organization that will go out and like capture people who don't agree with him. They'll be imprisoned or executed. And the second person, which people tend to be more aware of, is Hitler. So Hitler is going to be able to come to power in Germany because a lot of economic issues stemming from World War I and the Great Depression. So the Treaty of Versailles from World War I blamed Germany for the entire war. They had to pay large reparations. That's war repayments. It destroys their economy, and there's high unemployment. People are demoralized. They're really upset about this treaty that hurts them. And there's this Ruhr crisis. So the Ruhr crisis is this moment where, in order to try to pay back their war debts, the German government decides to print more money. Just print more money, but it leads to massive inflation and their money becomes worthless. So in class, I talked about and showed you images of like kids playing with blocks of Deutschmarks as building blocks, or they were burning Deutschmarks, their money, in fireplaces instead of buying wood. They would use it for toilet paper or to wallpaper their walls because it's cheaper than buying these items. You need a wheelbarrow full of money to go buy bread. And it just was crushing the economy. And Hitler comes along and talks about how he's going to pull Germany up. He's going to make them this wonderful nation again. He's going to end all their problems. And eventually he gets elected as leader and makes himself chancellor. It's like almost like a czar almost. It's, he's going to be this one totalitarian ruler. And he uses secret police like Mussolini. He forces women and Jewish people from jobs. He creates a Hitler Youth program to brainwash the youth. He creates these Nuremberg laws to restrict the rights of Jews. They can't intermarry. They can't have jobs in the media because he doesn't want them to influence, anyone, on the airwaves. They can't work in education or law or medicine. And basically, he uses Jewish people in Germany as the scapegoats for all these problems happening in Germany. And he's breaking these rules of the Treaty of Versailles left and right. He is invading places like Poland, Czechoslovakia. He's building up the military again. He wasn't supposed to do that under the Treaty of Versailles, but he does. He's completely fascist, using propaganda to promote his ways. And Europe is so terrified of another world war, they allow for him to do this. And this, is that idea of appeasement. They're appeasing him. They're giving into his demands to avoid a war. And this takes place at the, Munich conference. Germany had invaded Poland and Czechoslovakia, and in Munich, they're like, okay, that's fine, just don't do any more. But of course, they're not going to stop. He's not going to stop until he's stopped. So World War II starts. And Hitler is rounding up Jewish people, Christians, homosexuals, people with mental and physical handicaps, gypsies, anyone that didn't fit his idea of like that perfect Aryan German race, or questioned him, were gone. First they would be sent to ghettos, and then they would be put in concentration camps, and eventually death camps. But ultimately, you have the Allies go into war against Germany, Italy, and Japan. You have Germany pushing throughout Europe, into France, until finally this D-Day invasion is like that big turning point where the U.S. and Great Britain and her allies storm the beaches of Normandy and France and start to push Germany back. And that's where things are going to start to change. Sometimes in World War II, they also talk about the new technologies, jet engines, radars, sonars, the atomic bomb. And the U.S. will defeat Germany. Later, Japan will be defeated after the U.S. drops 2 atomic bombs on Japan, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, demonstrating not just new technology, but how powerful we are. But we also, Europeans, look at what happens during the Holocaust and are appalled. Like, this cannot happen again. And the Nuremberg trials would be held to put German officers on trial for their crimes against humanity. And, we're determined never again. This is never going to happen again. People need to be held accountable. And the Nuremberg trial shows that, people can and will be held accountable for war crimes. A number of people who are high-ranking officials in the Nazi military are executed for their crimes. Some of them flee to South America to escape persecution. Over the years, some of them have been found. Others really got away with some of this. But we're showing the world we're going to stand up. We also see that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights will be established, outline rights that people should have, in an attempt to kind of lay groundwork for, these are human rights. They shouldn't be infringed upon. And we also see that the United Nations will be created. The League of Nations failed to protect anyone. And so that needs to be replaced. The United Nations is created as this, world peace organization. The United States joins as well. And they are going to work to try to maintain peace, prevent more human rights violations, and oversee, developing nations to try to help and support them as, they develop, and some of these nations that gain independence. So I'm going to just check. I think I have a question really quick. Difference between communism and fascism. Great question, because I see people get confused with this a lot. Hitler and Stalin hated each other. Fascists hate communism, and communists hate fascists. So communism is this idea that, it's a classless society. Everyone's equal. They work together. They share everything that's produced in their country. It's, just as much a political as like an economic, policy. Fascists are not communists. There is capitalism there, but they're very nationalistic. They're all about building up the nation's industries to benefit the entire nation as a whole, not just, the people. It's the nation before the individuals. Hitler had no problems targeting individuals in his society to remove them because he felt they didn't fit in where, his idea of a perfect society. But it was all about building up the strength and power of Germany. With communism, it's, you're supposed to be working for the people. The people have the power, the people have the means of production. That's not usually how it's worked out, because you end up with totalitarian dictators like Kim Jong-un in North Korea or Stalin in Soviet Russia. But fascist Germany, there's going to be capitalism. But that capitalism is going to be developing things useful for the nation, and needed for the people. So hopefully I answered that question a little bit for you. If there's any other ones. Okay. So yes, I'm going to talk about, when I talk about South Africa and apartheid, I'll talk about, I can talk a little bit about, how it relates to other examples of human rights violations. I can do that, yes. Okay. So the Cold War, and I know a lot of you were asking me about the Cold War, right? It's cold. We don't actually fight anyone. Let me get a drink. Thank you guys for hanging in there with me. Like, already an hour in, and we're at the Cold War. This is my lifetime. At least the end of it is. I'm just going to get comfy here. So the Cold War, you have tensions between the U.S., the United States, and the Soviet Union, the USSR, after World War II. And a lot of this stems from the fact that the U.S. is democratic, they're capitalistic, and communist nations, don't really match that. They're two different ideologies. And the Soviet Union and the United States are fighting over what's going to happen to Europe now that the war is over. Great Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union are in Germany. They divided it up until they could figure out how they're going to organize everything. And obviously, Russia's concerned. They had been invaded by Germany. Their people suffered greatly, and they don't want that to happen again. So the Soviet Union is really looking out for them and trying to protect them from being invaded again. So they want this buffer zone between them and Europe. They want eastern part of Europe to be communist. That way, there's a whole line of communist nations between the Soviet Union, and Europe. So if someone like Hitler wanted to invade Russia again, they had to go through all these other nations first before they can get to Russia. And so Russia was really pushing to create this, Eastern Bloc, or this communist bloc, this, zone of communist nations between them and Europe. Of course, the United States and her allies are like, no, we're going to make democracies, duh. And that has to do a lot with trade, because if all these nations fell to communism, they're not going to trade with capitalistic nations like Great Britain and the United States. But also, there's this element of, these people should have this self-determination, this, ability to determine the future of their own nations. They should be able to have democracies and representation. So what we see is this conflict ultimately leads into the Cold War. And Winston Churchill talks about the Iron Curtain, and people get this wrong all the time. The Iron Curtain is the political boundary. It's this imaginary line. It's not an actual line, but it's this line between the East and the West in Europe. East is communist, West is democratic. It's this very clear political division. And Winston Churchill is like, it's like an Iron Curtain has descended upon Europe. And the United States and Russia were like, you know what? We need to work with our allies to have security. So the United States signs NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, with Great Britain and Canada and all these other areas in Western Europe. And they form this military and economic alliance. And it's going to be this idea of collective security. Collectively, they can work together to ensure their safety. Of course, Russia is like, well, if they're going to have an alliance, we need an alliance. So Russia creates the Warsaw Pact. And this is going to be Soviet Russia and all those Eastern European nations that are now under the Soviet control. These are called Soviet satellites, places like East Germany, because that got divided, and Poland and Hungary, and so on and so forth. And this is going to be two massive alliance groups that are going to kind of go back and forth with tension throughout the Cold War. Sometimes on the regions, you'll see a question about like the Berlin airlift and the Berlin blockade. So before the Cold War really officially starts, you have this conflict over that Germany. What do we do with it? And the Soviets are in East Germany, and the U.S. and Great Britain and France are in West Germany, and they're still fighting. Russia got really upset, so they created a blockade around the city of Berlin and refused to let any of the Allies into Berlin or anyone out of Berlin. So for over a year, the United States airlifted supplies over that blockade to bring like food and fuel and medicine to the people of Berlin. And it's a really tense moment in the Cold War, because had the Soviets shot down a plane, or if anything happened, we could have ended up in a World War III like this. Ultimately, though, Russia's like, this isn't working, and so they lift that blockade. But that's what ultimately leads to that split between East and West Germany. East Germany becomes communist, West Germany will become democratic, and eventually the Soviet Union builds that Berlin Wall. And this is an actual wall in the city of Berlin, and it's going to separate East and West Germany. And the reason why the Soviets did this is that they had a lot of people flee in East Germany. Doctors, lawyers, educators, people with specialized degrees were fleeing East Germany to try to get to West Germany. And there's this massive shortage of laborers, workers, people with high levels of education. They needed to stop people from deflecting or leaving. So they built this wall there. And I see a lot of people get that confused with the Iron Curtain. So Iron Curtain is an imaginary line. It marks the political division between East and West Germany. And then the Berlin Wall is an actual physical wall. And we'll be talking about that wall again when we talk about the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So elements of the Cold War, you have the arms race. The Soviet Union and the U.S. fight with each other through this arms production. Who can make bigger, better weapons? Who can stockpile more nuclear weapons? The space race, who can get a man on the moon? You have the Soviet Union launch Sputnik, the first satellite. Oh yeah, well the U.S. put a man on the moon, take that. And someone's going to come in to clean really quick. And so with this space race, it creates tension there as well. But we also have these hot spots or proxy wars. So these are places like Korea, Vietnam, where actual fighting takes place between these communist and non-communist forces. And the U.S. will pick the non-communist side, the Soviet Union picks the communist side, and there's a conflict there. But the U.S. and the Soviet Union never declare war on each other. So with the hotspots, you have North Korea. North Korea falls to communism. They have this division at the demilitarized zone, the 38th parallel. North Korea is still communist, South Korea democratic. North Korea still suffers from a lot of economic issues, a lot of famine. Meanwhile, there's capitalism and democracy in South Korea, and they economically are doing pretty well. Vietnam, the U.S. gets involved. The communists led by Ho Chi Minh push into South Vietnam, and after a long and bloody conflict, eventually the U.S. leaves and communism takes hold. But the U.S. got involved because of this idea of containment. The U.S. wanted to contain communism. They didn't want it to spread. They're afraid that if it spread to more areas, it could just continue to spread. And then the U.S. would lose vital trade partners. So they wanted to make sure it wasn't spreading outside the areas that already existed. And it was met with various degrees of success. U.S. managed to keep South Korea democratic, Vietnam not so much. We also see that there's a conflict in Afghanistan, in like the 1970s, where Russia invades Afghanistan and the U.S. gets involved, and ultimately Russia leaves, but it kind of destabilized, the area there. During this time, Russia and the U.S. were all part of the United Nations, and because they were so powerful, they were one of the 5 permanent members. People kind of vote in blocks. Either you're with the U.S. or you're with the Soviet Union. And during this whole Cold War, the UN was kind of ineffective. They weren't able to do as much as they could have because of this. Some of the Cold War items that comes up as well is the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. These are plans from the United States to try to contain communism by giving military and economic aid to places like Greece and Turkey. We also see that there's a massive conflict in Cuba. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the U.S. had put missiles in Turkey, really close to the Soviet border. So the Soviet Union wants to put missiles in Cuba, and the U.S. finds out about this. And the U.S. kind of tells the Soviets they have to pull those weapons out. They tell them they're not going to. The whole world holds their breath, waiting to find out if there's going to be a nuclear war. Ultimately, the Soviets do pull their weapons out of Cuba. The U.S. doesn't invade Cuba, even though there was an earlier attempt called the Bay of Pigs invasion, where the U.S. had trained Cuban refugees to invade Cuba. Unfortunately, it was a failure, and those people were captured by the leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro. And in the end, the U.S. removes their weapons from Turkey as well. The whole world breathes a sigh of relief because nuclear war was avoided. And this is a good example of this policy of brinkmanship. So brinkmanship is bringing your nation on the verge of war. So you have 2 nations almost like going to war right there, and then pull back a little bit. Okay, let me see. Another policy that might come up for the Cold War that they talk about is détente. And with détente, what you see is it's this easing of tension. So these are periods throughout the Cold War where tensions will kind of ease up between the Soviet Union and the United States. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything else that's really important that comes up. I think that's it. Okay. So there's different points where maybe there's agreements over weapons, like the SALT talks, where the U.S. and the Soviets agree that they're going to cut back on how many weapons they have stockpiled. But ultimately, the Cold War will come to an end when the Soviet Union collapses. So the Soviet Union has a number of different kind of eras. You have Stalin, and he's totalitarian. Then you have Nikita Khrushchev come in, and he de-Stalinizes, removes all of Stalin's statues and so on and so forth. But he's the one who builds the Berlin Wall, the actual physical wall in Berlin. And eventually we get to this guy in the 1980s called Gorbachev, and he comes up with these ideas of glasnost and petroska. So glasnost is openness. He's like, people should be able to question the government. We can discuss our problems so we can fix them. And then you also had Petroska. He's like, I'm going to restructure. And like Vladimir Lenin, we're going to allow some capitalism. But while this sounds great for the Soviet Union, what this does is allows a situation where people are like, oh, we can talk about the government now? You guys suck. We hate living under Soviet control. We want our own nation. So you get movements in like Poland to become independent. And eventually what we see, more and more nations want to be independent. People are, start to talk about how poor these economic policies have been, how much people are struggling. And eventually between more and more nations demanded independence and high levels of spending for the military during the Cold War, the Soviet Union just can't keep up. And eventually the Soviet Union collapses. The Soviet satellite nations become independent, and the Berlin Wall is taken down. For years, the Berlin Wall stood as this mark of Soviet power, and it's finally torn down, and East Germany and West Germany are reunited, and the Cold War comes to an end. So I have someone asking about Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. So Thomas Hobbes is kind of like this anti-Enlightenment thinker. He thought people were all bad and they needed a very strong ruler to rule them. And then John Locke, definitely know him. He is the Enlightenment philosopher, and he came up with, those ideas of natural rights. Everyone's born with these natural rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. He also believed that the government didn't protect those rights, that you should be able to overthrow them. And that's, kind of where people in America and France got their justification for revolution. They're like, oh, well, you're not protecting these rights, we can overthrow you. So John Locke's almost always on the Regents. I don't know if I've ever seen a Regents where there wasn't a question about John Locke or something about natural rights with him. And if you want to know more about the Enlightenment, I did that in my video yesterday, and I posted that video in Google Classroom. Just trying to see if there's anything else on the Cold War. Any other Cold War questions? Maybe something I didn't say that I forgot that you want to know about. I just went over the Communist Revolution a little while ago, so at the end you should be able to go back and rewind the tape. Rewind the tape like it's VHS. You should be able to backtrack on the video and watch it. Probably around 5 o'clock, so maybe like an hour in, I think I talked about it. So you can check those out. Whew. Okay, so let's talk about decolonization and nationalism. So I had some people say, can you please go over this? This is one of the last units we did in class. So decolonization is when places decolonize. So all these nations that were colonies now become independent. And that's going to tie into nationalism in many of these areas. So we'll start by, let's talk about Africa first, because I had someone ask me about South Africa. So let me get my notes so I don't forget anything important. So in Africa, you have a number of leaders who are nationalistic and fighting for independence. You have Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. You also are going to have Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. So Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana is a little bit more peaceful about it. Jomo Kenyatta, he is going to be a little bit more violent, but they're both able to push for independence and gain independence for their nations, because places in Europe are too tired. Tort reform won't be on the regions. I've never seen that on the regions. Won't really be able to keep up with them. They're struggling. They're trying to rebuild Europe. They're economically strained. And so they just start, giving a lot of these nations in Africa independence. But what we see is that a lot of this leads to problems. There's political instability because these nations have been controlled for so long that they don't know how to create their governments. There's a lot of conflicts, ethnic conflicts like the Hutus and the Tutsis, because those colonial borders, the borders established by Europeans, ignored tribal boundaries. They just pushed these tribes together or split tribes apart. There's also a lot of poverty. They don't have the medical and educational systems needed. They're also dependent on European goods, so it's hard for them to be self-sufficient. Resources were often wasted or kept by corrupt governments, and there's just a lot of problems there. One of the big issues that comes out of this is the Rwandan genocide in the 90s. So you have about 1.5 to 1 million Tutsis are massacred by the Hutu majority, and Tutsis are going to, flee for their lives from Rwanda, and the world didn't do anything for a couple of months, and then finally another group of Tutsis from a nearby nation invade and stop the massacre. But you have a case where's the UN? Why is the UN not stopping this? That's their job. And it's a massive human rights violations. There's a lot of violence against the Tutsis. And then of course the people who had left as refugees suffered in refugees camp. There's a lot of contaminated water, not enough food, and people were dying from disease and malnutrition. Okay, so South Africa. So what we see is South Africa was independent, I say, earlier than these other areas, because there was a nation established there by Europeans. It wasn't like a colony, but the white Europeans that had settled there, their descendants, these white South Africans, were the minority population. They were a small group, but they had all the power. So this is an example of a minority being in power, and they limited the rights of Black South Africans. They create this policy of apartheid, apart. Black South Africans are kept apart from the white South Africans. They have to live in these small, reservations. They are barred from having certain jobs. They need passports to travel. They can only go to certain areas that are marked for colors or mixed races. There was a number of protests against this. There's a violent. There's a protest in Sharpeville that turned violent when the government run by the white South Africans massacre the protesters. Nelson Mandela will help create the African National Congress, the ANC, and he's going to work with them to use violence to try to end apartheid. In the end, he and a lot of the members of the ANC are jailed. He's sentenced to jail and life. And for a while, protests were more violent, but people start to question this policy. I mean, it's the 1980s, and there's massive segregation. So some people might, compare this to the Holocaust or even segregation in the United States until the Civil Rights Movement here. You have a group being targeted because they don't fit in this ideal society. I think it's probably more similar to segregation in the U.S. than the Holocaust in Europe. But eventually, you get people questioning the violent movement. People like Desmond Tutu, who practices nonviolence and calls for civil disobedience, similar to what we'll see in India with Gandhi. And eventually, the world kind of gets on board. Great Britain, the United States, they create these economic sanctions. They refuse to trade with South Africa. They refuse to allow their professors to teach in the United States, etc. And they also are denied South Africa participating in the Olympics. And eventually, this is going to put a lot of political pressure on South Africa because they're starting to feel some economic strain because of these sanctions. Eventually, F.W. de Klerk, a white South African, is elected president, promising to start to roll back or remove the apartheid laws. And it's interesting because the only people who could vote in South Africa are white South Africans, but yet they elect this guy to be their president. And so that shows that their society is starting to change too, be it that they actually think Black South Africans should be equal to them, or the fact that they're feeling this economic burden because the world is refusing to trade with them. But change comes, and F.W. de Klerk releases Nelson Mandela from prison. And when Nelson Mandela is released from prison, he is bigger than ever. They put him in jail trying to silence him, but he continued to gain this celebrity status, this notoriety while in prison. And so when he comes out, he works with de Klerk to write a new constitution for South Africa. Apartheid is ended. There's a new constitution where Black South Africans can vote. In the next election, Black South Africans can vote, and they vote, and Nelson Mandela is elected the first Black president of South Africa. And it's a major victory for them. Nelson Mandela just died a couple of years ago, and former President Barack Obama, while he was president, attended, but he had won the Nobel Peace Prize. Nelson Mandela won that with F.W. de Klerk for their work together to end apartheid, apart in South Africa. So let me check to see if there's any other questions to see before I move on to India. Ooh, let's go to India. Oh. Okay. So India wanted independence for a while too, and they had been controlled by Great Britain. Great Britain ruled them through what was called the British Raj, R-A-J. Everyone knows I can't spell, but I spelled that right. You can't hold that against me. And so these Indian soldiers had fought side by side in World War I and World War II with Great Britain, and they saw all these nations that had been invaded and controlled by Germany getting independence, and they're like, we should have independence too. And people have been campaigning for independence in India for quite some time. I want to find my notes. I don't forget any key terms for you guys. One of the biggest leaders that comes out of this movement for independence that I keep mentioning, he's a good one to know for an essay, is Gandhi. So Gandhi had been trained and gone to school in Europe. He had done quite a bit of work in Africa while Africa was trying to gain independence from various European nations. And he came back to India really pushing for this. And you have two groups that kind of emerge. You have I'm never going to find these notes for you guys, so I don't miss anything. Give me a moment, because I don't want to miss any key points. Aha! Found it. Okay. So Gandhi starts to question the practices of the British Raj. They're like, there's this demonstration against Britain, and British soldiers gunned down all these peaceful protesters, killing over 300 people, and it's known as the Amritsar Massacre. So they're starting to question some of these violent movements. And Gandhi pushes for peace, these nonviolent protests, and he uses civil disobedience, like breaking certain laws. And he works within the Indian National Congress. So this is a group of people to represent Indians, and they try to work with Great Britain to get some reforms. And in this group are mostly Hindus and some Muslims. But the Muslim members of the Indian National Congress felt like they weren't being represented enough, so they created the Muslim League. And the Muslim League is to represent the Muslims in India and their interests. And they not only want independence for India, but they want India to be partitioned, to be put into parts. And they want a nation created for Muslims. And this is going to lead to the creation of India and Pakistan once India does gain independence. But Gandhi is going to start to really question all these practices that Great Britain has been carrying out. Great Britain charges this massive tax on salt. Salt comes from the Indian Ocean, but yet the people of India can't make their own salt. They have to buy it from Great Britain. And so Gandhi organizes these people and marches to the sea in what's called the Salt March. And he makes his own salt. He broke the law. That's an act of civil disobedience, breaking these unjust laws. He also starts this homespun movement. Don't buy British cloth made from Indian cotton. Make your own cloth. So he's often shown wearing like the white robe, and he's spinning cotton. That's the homespun movement. These are ways to boycott British goods and really send a message. ultimately, Great Britain will give India their independence, but it's kind of, this, bittersweet time for Gandhi because India is partitioned, it's broken up. Pakistan will be created for Muslims, and the rest of India will be created for Hindus. That doesn't mean that there's not Hindus in Pakistan or Muslims in India, but what we see is that Muslims will have a majority in Pakistan and Hindus will have a majority in India. And when this division happens, you have millions of people moving from Pakistan into India who are Hindu, and millions of people who are Muslim in India move into Pakistan. And there's going to be a lot of clashes as these people move across the border. And even today, in this border region called the Kashmir region, there's still a lot of clashes between these groups of people. They estimate out of the 10 million people who move between India and Pakistan, like 1 million of them died during this migration. And it's obviously very devastating. Jalal Nehru is another gentleman you might see. He's the gentleman who led the Muslim League, who really pushed for the creation of Pakistan, and he'll be their first prime minister. Let me just make sure I'm not missing anyone else. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens to China. What happens to China after Mao Zedong? Does anyone know? Hopefully you guys remember. So Mao's communist, and he creates a number of programs based on Stalin's 5-year plan. So much like Stalin's 5-year plan doesn't go so hot. There's a lot of issues. And so when Mao dies, Deng Xiaoping becomes the leader, and he creates these 4 modernizations. He's like, we are going to modernize the industry, farming, science, and the military. Oh, really quick, the Amritsar massacre was a massacre in India where people were protesting Great Britain and British soldiers gunned them down. There was like over 300 deaths. And a lot of people, that's, demonstrates the brutality of Great Britain's rule in India before India became independent. Okay, so back to China. So China, with the 4 modernizations, they are trying to modernize. They're trying to compete in this modern world. This is like in the late 70s, early 80s, and they are starting to allow now for some capitalism. So Xiaoping allows for some capitalism and foreign investment, but he does not give his people the democratic freedoms that tends to come with capitalism. So there's the Tiananmen Square massacre. You have this Tiananmen Square is this square in Beijing, and all these students from colleges meet, and they're protesting Xiaoping, who's like on his deathbed dying. And like, we want democratic reforms, we want freedom of speech. And Xiaoping is going to authorize the military to go in with their tanks, open fire on these protesters. Hundreds to thousands have died. We don't have exact numbers because the Chinese government censored that and won't release official numbers on that. But he totally crushes this and, does not allow for democratic reforms, and comes down even harder on these students to prevent them from having these democratic reforms. And that just kind of showed that, yeah, Xiaoping's willing to play with the big boys and allow some capitalism, but he is not going to allow any democratic freedoms for his people. Today in China, they are the #2 economy behind the United States. Lots of capitalism. They have a growing middle class, but they still have a lot of human rights violations, a lot of concerns for protection of the environment, exploitation of workers, a huge population. Under Mao Zedong, they actually had instituted that one-child policy to try to maintain the control over the population. So each family could only have one child. During Mao's reign, Some of these children, if you got pregnant a second time, you might be forced to have an abortion. Sometimes nurses would sneak the second baby out and give it to a wait-in relative. Some families would abandon children. Maybe they had a girl, but they preferred a boy, so they would abandon the girl. This created a lot of issues. Today, it's now a two-child policy, so they've kind of laxed that. It was always a little bit more relaxed in the rural parts of China because there's more space, but in the cities there's large population density, and it can become really problematic when the population gets too big and they can't feed them or find homes for them anymore. Okay. We can talk about some other genocides, examples of genocide. So this is a good one for an essay, if they give you an essay on human rights violations. So in Cambodia, that's Southeast Asia, they fall to communism, and you have Pol Pot is their leader. And he is the leader of the Khmer Rouge. And the Khmer And I'm back. I had a quick disconnect. Sorry. So the Khmer Rouge, run by Pol Pot, is in Cambodia, is extremists. They force all the people to leave the cities and join these collective farms. A lot of people die from starvation. They don't have a lot of medicine. Anyone who was middle class or educated, especially educated in the West, were executed or sent to work camps. They estimate about 1.5 to 2 million people died, and the outside world didn't really do anything to stop this. He had what was known as like the killing fields, where there was mass executions, and the bodies would just be left there as a symbol to other people who might question Pol Pot. It was really disturbing what he's done. So that's a good one to know, along with like the Hutus and Tutsis. So the massacre of the Tutsis. Other more modern genocides would be like Slobodan Milosevic in Bosnia, where people who were executed because of their ethnicities. Let me see if there's anything I don't want to miss there. Like a lot of information in such a short time. Well, I'm looking this up to make sure I'm not missing any other things. Okay. We haven't talked really about the Middle East yet, so I'm going to go there next if there's no other questions about some of these global issues. So okay. So let me check to make sure there's nothing on Twitter really quick. Ooh, good question. Guerrilla war. So guerrilla war came up when I talked about the Chinese Revolution. It was also big during the Vietnam War. So guerrilla war is this tactic where instead of fighting your enemy head on, you do these like hit and run tactics. So like in Vietnam, often soldiers from like the Viet Cong, the communists in North Vietnam, would hide in the woods, in the forest, and as like the U.S. troops would come through, they would open fire on them and then run away and disappear. And these quick attacks are really hard to kind of figure out, like, well, who's attacking us, where are they coming from, and it can lead to heavy losses for the nations being attacked. So that's a good one to know as well. Okay, so let's go to the Middle East. So a lot of the Middle East was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And then when the Ottoman Empire collapses, they start to get their independence. But if you remember, the Middle East is this cultural crossroads. There's a lot of trade routes. It's very wealthy. Plus, they have a lot of oil, and a lot of it's in desert areas. So there's conflicts over resources such as water as well. Like, who's going to control the water? Who gets access to it? If the Armenian genocide, just real quick, is on the regions, it would be just a general multiple choice question about genocide and human rights violations. So you might see like, what does the massacre in Armenia and the killing fields in Cambodia and the massacre of Tutsis have in common? It's human rights violations. You only need to know two like genocides or human rights violations really well in case you had like an essay on them. They're not going to ask you any specific multiple choice questions about each genocide. Okay, so in the Middle East, there's a lot of conflict. There's areas they've been, fighting amongst themselves or destabilized because places are involved there. And you see that there's different groups interested in the Middle East. So I'm going to start first looking at, let me see if I find it, the issue between Palestine and Israel. So Palestine and Israel, the conflict, kind of dates back to kind of around World War I. So in biblical times, the Jewish people lived in, this, region that's Israel today, and they had been driven out of that land and dispersed throughout the rest of Europe. And you have the Palestinians, the Arabs, that had established a nation and had been a nation there for generations, centuries since. But during World War I, you see Great Britain is starting to get involved in the region. And they're interested because of oil and resources. But you also have this movement by Jewish people, and it's called Zionism. And Zionists want a homeland for Jewish people. And they want to create the nation of Israel. But of course, you also have the Arabs who are living in the same region. So you have three groups all interested in this area. And Great Britain is, playing both sides of the table, so to speak. So Great Britain writes a letter to Ali ibn Hussein, who is this leader, the Sharif of Mecca in the Arabian Peninsula. And they're like, hey, if you help us fight the Ottomans, we'll make sure that you get independence in your own nation when the war is over. So this is World War I. But at the same time, there's what's called the Balfour Declaration, which is a statement made to Zionists saying, we support the Zionist desire for a homeland for Jewish people in what at the time was called Palestine. So you have Great Britain making promises to two different groups of people about the same land. That land doesn't even belong to Great Britain. That's World War I. So fast forward, we hit World War II. And during World War II, we have the Holocaust. And following that, the Zionist movement, comes out like, we need a homeland to prevent this from happening to ourselves again. And so the nation of Israel will be created by the United Nations for Jewish people. And they start to move into this region. And as soon as they start to move into this region, tensions increase with the Arab Palestinians, who are mostly Muslim, and the Jewish Israelis moving into the area. And this is a question of, who does this territory belong to? Palestinians have been there for generations. They had established a nation. But then you have Israelis who claimed from biblical times that this is their homeland. And of course, in this era, you also have Jerusalem, which is the Holy Land for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. So it's a very delicate situation. The land that was originally created for Israel over the years had increased as Israel increased and expanded their borders, leading to numerous conflicts with the Palestinian people. You have hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who have fled as refugees. And there's a couple organizations that come out of this. You have the Palestinian Liberation Organization called the PLO, whose goal is to liberate Palestine from Israel, to eradicate Israel. And so for many Palestinians, this group is, there to represent them and to help them, as refugees, be reestablished and to reestablish their nations. But to Israelis, they see the PLO as like a terrorist organization. And this has led to a number of conflicts. Maybe there'll be a suicide bomber who was associated with the PLO, and then the Israeli army would respond with missile attacks. But then you also later get this group called Hamas. And if you guys have been watching anything with Wonder Woman, the actress, who plays Wonder Woman was a member of the Israeli military as an Israeli citizen. She had to be, and she had tweeted a comment about Hamas. So for many, Hamas is a terrorist organization attacking Israel. But at the same time, they've also created, systems for these Palestinian refugees, education, healthcare. They are very traditional fundamentalists when it comes to their beliefs of Islam and Sharia law. So it's a very complicated issue with this region. And you probably hear, still there are these issues going on back and forth. But the main thing to keep in mind, in case you saw like a conflict, is just this, on the regions, is this idea that the British makes a promise in the Balfour Declaration and to the letter to Ali ibn Hussein, to two different groups. You have Israelis who are mostly Jewish, and then you have Palestinians who are mostly Muslim, and they're fighting over who this territory belongs to. And you've seen that other Arab nations around Israel and Palestine have sided with Palestine, and then other nations have sided with Israel. And this has just increased conflict and led to a number of issues in that in the Middle East region. Trying to see if I missed anything else. I don't want to leave anything off for you guys. Any questions about Israel or Palestine before I talk about anything else that you guys had questions on? I can't remember if I said this. Okay. Okay, so other areas in the Middle East as well. We have Iran. So Iran had started to modernize and westernize under Shah Reza, and they were closely tied with the U.S. and other European nations. And this really angered some people in Iran. They started to criticize the Shah. They're like, you're too influenced by these outside nations. We need to get rid of this foreign influence. And they have a revolution, and it's called the Iranian Revolution, led by Ayatollah Khomeini. So Ayatollah Khomeini overthrows the Shah and creates a religious government. It's an Islamic republic. And, he gets rid of all these foreign influences. He rolls back a lot of rights and freedoms for women. Women have to now cover themselves. Women can't drive. They can't be educated. And this becomes really problematic. And what we see is even today, there's a very strict Islamic government in Iran. And there has been some concern that Iran's developing nuclear weapons, which has led to the United States creating some sanctions against Iran as well. So sanctions are like, refusing to trade with them and things like that. But a lot of times you see a multiple choice about the Iranian Revolution. They go from westernizing and modernizing, and they kind of roll it back to a very traditional society, highly influenced by these very strict fundamental Islamic beliefs under Ayatollah Khomeini. Okay, so the next place I want to talk about, if there's no other questions about Iranian Revolution or anything like that, is Turkey. So Turkey is on this Iberian Peninsula, and it was like at one point during the Middle Ages, this is where the Byzantine Empire was, and then they were conquered by the Ottomans. And when the Ottoman Empire fell after World War I, Turkey is established, and Turkey is going to modernize and westernize under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. So Ataturk westernizes and modernizes Turkey. People have to wear Western-style clothes. He bans the fez, and if you like Doctor Who, that's what Matt Smith used to wear, the little red hat. He told women that, he preferred them to wear more Western-style clothes. If they wanted to wear traditional clothes, that's okay, but you can't cover your face. So if you wanted to wear a veil over your hair, that's fine, but your face can't be covered. He creates a modern Turkish alphabet, different from Arabic that had been used. He creates a constitution. They create like a democracy. Women have the right to vote, and he does all of this. So a lot of times you'll see Ataturk get compared to Peter the Great because they both westernize and modernize. And so what happens in Turkey is like the opposite of what happened in Iran after Ayatollah Khomeini had that revolution. So Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran goes from modern Western to very traditional Islamic Republic. Ataturk goes from, this, traditional society under the Ottomans to a very modern, westernized democracy in Turkey. Okay. Going through. I can't remember if I had mentioned when I was talking about like imperialism, if I had mentioned the Boxer Rebellion, but the Boxer Rebellion was in China, and this is similar to the Sepoy Mutiny. This is a reaction to like foreigners and trying to get rid of foreign influence. The Boxers was this group of Chinese martial artists, and that's why they call them the Boxers. And they tried to eliminate Christians and foreign influence in China. But all these European nations united together to crush the Boxer Rebellion so that they could continue to influence China so that they could trade there. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else on Twitter. I think my cell phone might be dying soon. I might have to go to the internet. I don't think I have anything else really. Let me go through. I'm going to go through really quick. If you think of any questions, what time is it? Oh, it's almost 6 o'clock. Okay. Let me just really quick go through. Ooh, yes, here we go. Here's some terms and concepts for the modern era. The Sepoy Mutiny, that was in India. So when India was controlled by the British, the Sepoys were Indian officers and soldiers in the British military, and they were Hindu and Muslim. And they mutinied, they rebelled because there was a new rifle that they were supposed to use, but the cartridges had this coating of animal fat, and the animal fat was either pork or cow, and cows are sacred to Hindus and Muslims can't eat pork. So in order to use the cartridge, you had to bite the end off and stick it inside, the cartridge inside your rifle. So they would have to bite this cartridge covered in animal fat, and it was seen as this kind of insult to their religions and cultures. So the Sepoys were not using those, and they rebelled and attempted to fight back. But other Sepoys who had nice cushy lives in the British military and of course British soldiers were able to put down that mutiny. Key things, terms, concepts to know. The Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution is about new types of like fertilizers, GMOs. So this is all about food. So think green, salad's food. The Green Revolution, we're trying to increase food production in the world so that we can deal with famine and food shortages globally. Globalization, keep in mind. So like the world is connected more so today than any other time in the world. Globalization, kind of like westernization, like the globe is, united. There's a lot of cultural diffusion. We're interdependent, like we're relying on each other. There's, very few areas where they don't trade globally. Everyone's involved. Human rights. So these are rights that, should belong to every human. Things like, freedom of, to your life, freedom of religion. You should be able to, be able to pursue like a career and make money. You should be able to choose your religion. All these are laid down in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was created after the Holocaust. Genocide. So you think of genocide, this is where like, it's a large-scale massacre of humans, because of, political or social reasons, typically. Desertification. So desertification is the expansion of deserts. So this is happening a lot in the Sahara Desert. So because of too much overgrazing, animals are eating too much like grasses, but also deforestation. Like deforestation is like when forests are cut down. This is increased desertification. So desert is expanded in desertification. So in the Sahara, because of all these conditions, the Sahara Desert is expanding in the Sahel region. So I just think about it's hot as Sahel. So in the Sahel region, it's hot, it's dry because of like overgrazing and deforestation. The soil is becoming infertile, and then it's slowly becoming desert. And so the Sahara Desert is expanding down into that Sahel region. Deforestation, again, is when forests are being cut down. This happens a lot in the Amazon, either for lumber or as, they try to create like hydropower plants. They need to like flood areas. And so like the, Amazon rainforest is being cut down as well. No, OPEC. This is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So this has to do with oil. So a lot of the Middle Eastern nations are members of OPEC, and OPEC basically regulates how much oil is going to be produced. So they try to regulate it so there's not too much or too little. NAFTA. So this is a North American Free Trade Organization, or I'm sorry, agreement. So this is a trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And this is, a symbol of globalization. You have these three nations, and they get rid of tariffs, which are taxes on imports, with each other so that they can freely trade with each other. EU, this is the European Union. So this is like a political and economic union with many nations in Europe. Most of them share one currency, the euro. And again, globalization, trying to, reduce borders and increase cooperation. Okay. Some other general concepts that I didn't go over yesterday. Monsoons. So sometimes they talk about monsoons. They're really important for India. They bring heavy rains, which are necessary for, excuse me, they're really necessary for India's agricultural production. They also can be very devastating. If it rains too much, it can flood villages and cities. If it doesn't rain enough, there could be drought and lack of food. A topographic map. Sometimes in those first couple of questions on the regions, they ask you a map question. A topographic map is like basically the layout of the land. Like you'll see like elevation, or I always say like it's kind of like when you look at a like Google satellite image, you can see like the elevations and mountains and things like that. Economics is like the study of, how societies produce what they need and distribute items. Like, so think about like stuff like trade, money, bartering. A primary source, so this is something, it's like a first-hand account, maybe it's like a diary, or like an artifact. And a secondary source is something like a textbook. It's something that's, compiled after the fact. Ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is this idea that your ethnicity or like nation is like better than other people. So you see this like in early Chinese history. And cultural diffusion, that's like the $1 million term from Global 9. So this is when culture, ideas, culture, ideas, technology, all this is spreading, because of cultural diffusion. So a great example of that would be the Columbian Exchange. So with the Columbian Exchange, you have massive cultural diffusion taking place. Other examples of cultural diffusion would be spread of like religions like Buddhism or Christianity. A traditional economy, if you see a question about traditional economy, would be anything like farming. Typically, they are they have let's see, barter. So barter is like trade. So like, hey, I'm really good at making roofs and you have a cow. I'll trade you my services of building a roof in exchange for a cow. So like you're bartering and trading. I'm running through my list of like key things to make sure. Some of you, you might see like Socrates or Plato or Aristotle. These are Greek philosophers. You don't have to remember what they taught. You just need to recognize that they're Greek philosophers. They might show up. Ooh, some key explorers. How to pass. Focus on big ideas, key terms and people, things like that. Take your time. Use the test to take the test. Other tips. Process of elimination. I look for what I know is wrong, what doesn't fit. If it doesn't make sense, get rid of it. It's if you know what imperialism is, what communism is, things like that, you should be able to figure out the answers. What would make the most sense. So a couple of people I might have left out. Zhang Hong. It looks like Zheng He. He is a explorer for the Chinese, and he goes out and explores all over like the Indian Ocean into Africa and brings back all kinds of goods. But eventually his explorations are ended and China closes itself back off. Let's see, anything else that I might have left off? Oh, Hanseatic League, I don't know if I mentioned this yesterday, but during the Middle Ages, the Hanseatic League was a group in Germany of sailors and navigators, and they would kind of help protect the seas and each other from pirates, and they would help train navigators. So that might come up while in the Middle Ages in Renaissance. Humanism during the Renaissance, so that's like, humans, what can they do? They're most important now. We're going to focus on the abilities and accomplishments of human beings. Any other questions? Other explorers are going to be key. I mentioned them yesterday, but Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo explored. They kept journals. Those are really big. Let me check. I'm going to do a last call here for questions because it's after 6 now and I have to drive home. But you'll be able to watch this video. You can roll it back and watch it. Enlightenment. So you might see Montesquieu, Rousseau, Voltaire, Locke. These are Enlightenment philosophers. If you remember that, you'll be fine. The Enlightenment, remember, that's like, kind of like this enlightened ideas, new ways of looking at things. Galileo, Copernicus, these are people from the scientific revolution. You could try to keep them in mind. They will, occasionally pop up, and if you can remember they have to do a scientific revolution, you should be okay. So the Treaty of Tordesillas, I probably said that wrong. That they're never going to ask you a question about that on the regions. It has to do with conflicts between Spain and Portugal over land. That has to do, but that's never going to be a question. If they ask you anything, it's going to either be about the encounter, like what happens when Native Americans and the conquistadors, the Spanish conquerors meet up, or they're going to ask you about the Columbian exchange, all that, diffusion of plants, animals, flora, fauna, because of Columbus's, discovery of the New World and what happens when the New World and the Old World starts to interact. But they're never going to ask you a specific question on the regions about that treaty. Secularism. So this, is going to be really popular during the Enlightenment. So you think secular, like these are things that are worldly. They don't have to do with religion. So Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was everything. Religion was everything. People's lives were horrible. And, they had this idea that if I live this, a good Christian life, even though this life sucks, at least I have the afterlife and I'll go to heaven and it's paradise. But by the time we hit the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, people are like, well, why does my life have to suck now? And so during like the Enlightenment, people start to question that. And they're like, well, why can't I have a happy life? Why can't I have rights and protections? Why can't we focus on secular things here, now, on this earthly plane? Ooh, here's a good one. Command economy. I'm not sure if I said this yesterday, but a command economy is often linked to communism. So this is a situation where the government commands or controls the economy. They tell you, what to make, how much to make, how much to sell it for, etc. And that's going to be associated with communism, especially with like people like Stalin or Mao Zedong. Ooh, another one, free market economy. So the free market economy is going to be related to capitalism. So the free market, so that's, the market of like supply and demand. People are going to demand goods, you're going to supply them, the government's going to stay out of it, and it's going to operate freely. And that's going to be tied to Adam Smith and capitalism. I'm just running through my key terms here. These are key terms that come up the most, and just making sure I didn't miss any between yesterday and today that might come up. Again, I'm going to say at like 6:15, I'm going to probably cut this off. So if there's any other questions, you can bring them up. Self-determination, I mentioned it earlier, but this is one that I think students really struggle with. And this is something that does pop up on the regions a bit. So this is going to have to do with like World War I. And President Wilson of the United States had his plan for peace called the 14 points. And one of those points was this idea of self-determination. He's like, these nations should be able to determine the future of their nations, and they should be able to engage in that discussion and participate in that government. So this idea is like self-determination. You determine things yourself, and it has to do with nations as they are established after World War I. And, this happens to various degrees of success. Some nations, they don't really get a say. And then, of course, that sets up the area for more conflict later on. But that was, President Wilson firmly believed. He was like, if we want to maintain peace, we can't punish Germany, which they did. And we need to allow these other nations to be able to figure things out and determine the future of their nations themselves. Otherwise, it's just going to create more conflicts. I think that's it for what I have for like key. Remember, those of you who are coming in, some of the names I don't recognize. You might be from other classes or other schools, which is fine. What I did here was I really focused on key ideas, main concepts that pop up the most. The multiple choice that you will see on the Regents is very general. It's going to be, key ideas, overarching concepts. They like to compare things like Peter the Great and Ataturk modernized and westernized, or the Sepoy Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion were against, foreign influence, things like that. They're not going to ask you, like, at what year did the Russo-Japanese War happen? But they will ask you, like, in general. So, like, the Russo-Japanese War was this war between Russia and Japan over land and resources as Japan imperialized. So you might see a question where it'll say, so the Russo-Japanese War, the Sino-Japanese War, which is a war with China and Japan for land and resources, and the rape of Nanking are all, have to do with what? And that would be Japanese imperialism. And I don't think I mentioned the rape of Nanking, but when Japan had invaded China during World War II, they went through the city of Nanking and raped and killed many of the citizens there. And this was seen as a huge human rights violation. And even today, China, many people in China hold this against Japan because there was never like a formal apology. So after the Russo-Japanese War, someone asked if the Europeans saw Japan as like a threat. And I think, this is a point where I think people are starting to recognize that Japan is a major role player now. They've beat Russia. Russia's huge. They're imperializing. And, the U.S. will create sanctions against Japan for their invasion of China. And, this is part of the reason why the U.S. gets pulled in, because while we were negotiating with Japan to get Japan to leave China, and again, you'll never get a question about all of this, but we were negotiating, the U.S. was negotiating with Japan to get Japan to pull out of China when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and then the U.S. joined World War II. You won't get a multiple choice question about those details. What you will get, though, is essay topics, thematics, or DBQs, and that's where some of this information can come into play. So let me just scroll up and make sure I didn't miss any other questions. I think I got that. Okay, so a couple more minutes for last questions. For the essays, I would recommend doing like a quick outline so you don't forget anything. With the DBQ, before you even look at the documents, think about which of those, they'll give you 3 topics usually. Think about which of those 2, because you have to pick 2 out of the 3 to write about, the most about, and just jot down what you know about them. Because a lot of people get so sucked in and focus on the documents that they don't put outside information. So if you, get an essay, and maybe it's about totalitarian rulers, and they have like Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. You're like, oh, I know a lot about Stalin and Hitler. Jot down what you know about them before you look at the documents. With a thematic, it's going to be about a theme. And so just think about the theme. And they usually will give you several options. You're not limited to those, but they give you an idea. I was just thinking about, well, what do I think I know the most about? Again, do an outline. I see people miss the most, like they lose points on the thematic because they don't complete the task. Usually there's like a last little bit that people leave out and they forget. So if you make a little outline about, okay, so this is the topic and these are the things I have to write about, just a couple words or whatever for each of those, or key people or key things that you don't want to forget. And then when you're writing, you can go back and check and be like, oh, I got this. Oh, I forgot this. Let me go back and put this in. That way you can make sure you hit all that. For the documents, like you have to answer all the questions on the documents, and be careful. These should be easy points. And I've noticed great in the US is that some people just write down like a quote from the document and expect that's right, and that's not always correct. So you have to be careful. I recommend, if you really struggle with the documents, use the question to turn it into like the start of a sentence. So they're like, according to this document, what is one effect of imperialism on Africa? I would say one effect of imperialism on Africa is, then I'd go into the document and I would find my answer and write it out and then read it. So one effect of imperialism on Africa is traditional borders were ignored by the Europeans, and this leads to conflict. And then you go back, you read it. If it makes sense, you're like, I got it. If it doesn't make sense, it's not a complete sentence, it's probably not a correct answer. Go back and double check it. It's so important. Those should be free points. The answers in the document. Just look at it and be careful. I always recommend writing complete sentences so that you don't screw up. Sometimes we're not allowed to award points if you give a vague answer. So like on the same thing I gave, like if you're just like, what's one effect of imperialism on Africa, and you wrote borders, that's a vague answer and you won't get points for that. So you have to be really careful. Some other things. Oh, reminder, no pencils. It's all pen. Dark blue or black ink. Make sure you only bring pen. I recommend like a basic ballpoint pen like this, because if you use a gel pen, they'll bleed through the page, and then when they go to scan them at the state, it could throw off your scores and you could like lose points. So make sure that you bring a regular ballpoint pen. If you're at my school, I know we usually have a couple extra in case yours dies while you're writing your essays, but please only pen. Leave your pencils at the door or leave them home, even better. You can't have any cell phones, no smartwatches, no Fitbits, no Apple Watches, no iPads, nothing. Leave all that stuff at home. Okay, so last call for questions. If there's nothing else, I'm going to sign off. I hope this helped. I know this is about a little over 2 hours. I have my video from yesterday as well on my page that you can check out. Those of you in my Google Classroom, I'm going to go ahead and post these videos for easy access. I'm just double checking to make sure there's no one else on Twitter who was tweeting me any questions. I'm going to drive home. It might take me an hour and a half or so. But what I'm going to do is before I go to bed, I'll come back and I'll check comments on this YouTube video, and I'll also check comments in my Google Classroom. So if there's a question you had and you're like, oh my goodness, I will try to answer those before I go to sleep. But please don't stress. Sorry, I have my shoes off, so I'm putting them back on. If it gets to be like 10 o'clock or something, and don't push yourself. It is better that you get a good night's sleep than stay up late studying. You will do better with a good night's sleep, well rested, than if you stay up till 2 in the morning trying to cram. Chances are, if you don't know by now, you're not going to remember it for the test. And that's okay. You don't have to remember everything. You only need to remember, certain big key ideas. So please, please, please don't drive yourself crazy. Get a good dinner, a good night's sleep, wake up, have a nice breakfast. Don't panic. You've been working hard. If you're here watching this video right now, you're doing something, right? You're doing work. So please don't panic. Do your best. Use the test to take the test. Process of elimination. Think about the question. Put it into your own words. If there's a document or image or a map or a chart, the answer is right there in front of you. Just take your time. You know, if you're not certain, like, you know, star it in the test booklet and come back to it. Just make sure when you're bubbling your answer sheet, you skip that space, you know, for that number, so you don't get to the end and realize you have 49 completed answers and you're missing one. You got to figure out where you messed it up. So best of luck, everyone. And again, if you have any more questions, you can post in either my Google Classroom if you're in my class, or on this YouTube video, and I will try to get back to you guys before bed.